I had been retired for almost 3 years, and my family had completely misunderstood what that meant. To them, I was just an old man living quietly in a small apartment, wearing the same faded jacket and driving an old car. My son Daniel once joked that I looked like a retired beggar, and everyone at the dinner table laughed. I smiled with them because none of them knew the truth. I had deliberately built that simple life so nobody would know what I had spent decades creating. I had never told my children about the company I started when I was 32, or the investments I made before anyone in my family knew my name. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and after that, I stopped caring about expensive houses, luxury cars, or showing people what I owned. But everything changed one Sunday afternoon when my daughter, Emily, invited the entire family to dinner. As soon as I walked through the door, I noticed the way everyone looked at me. My clothes were simple, my shoes were old, and I carried a small grocery bag in my hand. Emily whispered to her husband, "Dad really needs to take better care of himself." I pretended not to hear. Then Daniel looked at me and laughed. "You look like you are waiting outside a supermarket for someone to give you money." Everyone laughed again. I sat down quietly, but something inside me broke. Not because they thought I was poor, but because they had forgotten everything I had done for them. I had paid for Daniel's education, helped Emily buy her first home, and supported them whenever they needed money. They simply believed I had nothing left. Then halfway through dinner, my phone rang. I stepped outside to answer it. It was my private attorney, James. His voice was unusually serious. "Sir, we have a situation. The board has approved the transfer of your $3 billion fortune, but someone in your family has made a claim against your estate." I froze. "Who?" James paused before saying, "Your son." I could barely believe what James had just told me. "Daniel made a claim against my estate?" I asked. James replied, "Yes," he told the estate attorney, "that you were no longer mentally capable of managing your assets, and that the family should take control of your fortune." I stood outside Emily's house, staring through the window at the people laughing around the dinner table. My own son had just called me incapable while sitting inside a home I had helped him buy. I asked James if Daniel had any evidence. He submitted several statements from family members claiming that you have become confused since retirement, he said. My stomach tightened. I knew exactly what this meant. Daniel had been watching my simple lifestyle and assuming it was proof that I had lost everything. James then said something even more disturbing. "He is also trying to gain access to the investment accounts connected to your family trust." I immediately told him to freeze everything. "Do not let anyone touch a single account until I give written permission." James agreed. But before ending the call, he added, "There is one document Daniel does not know about." I asked what it was. James said, "Your original ownership agreement from the company you founded. It proves that you still control the majority of the shares." I looked back through the window and saw Daniel talking confidently with his sister. He had no idea that the company he thought belonged to a group of investors was actually still controlled by me. For years, I had allowed a professional management team to run it while I lived quietly. I did not want my family to know because I wanted to see whether they loved me or simply loved what they believed I could give them. Now I was finally getting my answer. I walked back inside and sat at the table. Daniel looked at me and smiled. "Dad, everything all right?" I looked directly at him and calmly replied, "Everything is fine, son." He had no idea that my lawyer was already preparing the documents that would reveal exactly how much I was worth. I stayed at the dinner table, quietly watching Daniel talk about my future, as if I were already incapable of making my own decisions. He told Emily that I needed someone to look after my finances, and Emily nodded as if she agreed. I said nothing. I knew that if I confronted them too soon, they would simply deny everything. After dinner, I returned to my apartment and found James waiting for me with a thick black folder. "Sir, we have confirmed everything," he said. Inside were documents showing that Daniel had already contacted a private wealth manager and attempted to arrange access to several accounts. I asked James how far he had gone. "Far enough to believe he will eventually control everything." I looked at the documents and felt no anger, only disappointment. Then James placed another file on the table. "There is something you need to see before we expose your fortune." It contained the latest valuation of the company I had founded decades earlier. The number at the bottom made me stare in silence. $3.02 billion. James explained that my family had no idea that I still owned the controlling shares. They believed I had sold the company years ago and spent everything I earned. That misunderstanding had been intentional. My late wife and I had agreed that our children should build their own lives, instead of depending on our wealth. But now Daniel was trying to take control of money he believed belonged to him. James then handed me a second document. "This is the estate claim your son submitted." I read it carefully. Daniel had written that I was mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and unable to protect my own interests. At the bottom was his signature. I looked at James and said, "Then tomorrow I want the board meeting." He nodded. "Do you want your identity as the majority owner revealed?" I looked at my son's signature one more time. Yes. Let him discover exactly who the retired beggar really is. The next morning, I arrived at the company headquarters with James beside me. I had not been inside that building for years, but the moment I walked through the doors, the receptionist immediately stood up. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." I nodded and continued toward the boardroom. Daniel was already there, sitting beside several executives. When he saw me, he looked annoyed. "Dad, why are you here?" I pulled out a chair and sat down. "I was invited to a meeting about my company." Daniel laughed. "Your company?" "Dad, you retired years ago." I looked around the room. Nobody corrected him. James placed a sealed folder on the table. "Actually, Mr. Carter never sold his controlling interest." Daniel's smile disappeared. One of the executives opened the folder and confirmed that I still owned the majority of the company, shares worth more than $3 billion. Daniel stared at the documents as if he could not understand what he was seeing. "That is impossible," he whispered. I calmly replied, "You never asked what I owned, Daniel. You only decided what you thought I had." Then James placed Daniel's estate claim beside the ownership documents. "Your son stated that you were mentally incapable of managing your assets," he said. The room became completely silent. Daniel tried to explain that he was only trying to protect me, but I stopped him. "You did not protect me. You tried to take control of everything because you thought I was poor." Daniel looked down at the table. Then the company chairman turned toward me and asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Carter, would you like to exercise your controlling authority today?" I looked at Daniel, then at the board. "Yes," I said quietly. "And my first decision is about my son's position in this company." I looked at Daniel and could see the fear in his eyes for the first time. "Dad, please. You cannot do this," he said. I reminded him that only minutes earlier he had told the board I was incapable of managing my own fortune. Now that the truth was sitting in front of him, he wanted me to forget everything. The chairman asked me what action I wanted to take. I said, "Remove Daniel from every position connected to my company, but do not destroy his life." Daniel stared at me in disbelief. "After everything I did, you are still helping me?" I answered, "I am your father. That does not mean I will allow you to control what is not yours." James then opened another folder and revealed something Daniel had not known. Years earlier, I had created a separate trust for my children, but the trust had one condition. They could receive their inheritance only if they proved they could manage money without betraying their family. Daniel had already violated that condition by making a false claim against me. The board officially removed him from his position, and his access to the company accounts was immediately canceled. Daniel lowered his head, but then he suddenly asked, "What about Emily? Does she know?" I looked at him and said, "Not yet." That evening, I invited both of my children to my apartment. They arrived expecting another lecture about money. Instead, I placed the company ownership documents on the table. Emily picked them up and stared at the valuation. "Dad, this says $3 billion. I nodded. Then I told them the truth I had hidden for years. I had never retired because I had lost my money. I had retired because I had already earned enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had simply wanted to know whether my children loved their father or the fortune they believed he had. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Then why did you let us think you were poor?" I looked at both of them and answered, "Because sometimes you only discover who truly loves you after they believe you have nothing left." I could see that my words had finally reached them. Emily was staring at the documents, while Daniel sat completely silent. Then Emily asked, "Dad, why did you never tell us?" I looked at her and said, "Because I wanted both of you to build your lives without believing my money belonged to you." Daniel lowered his head and admitted that he had made his claim because he believed I had become weak after retirement. "I thought you had lost everything," he whispered. I told him that was exactly the problem. He had not trusted me enough to ask. Instead, he had judged me by my clothes, my old car, and the small apartment where I chose to live. James then placed another document on the table. It was the final condition of the family trust. If either child attempted to take control of my fortune through deception, their inheritance would be suspended. Daniel immediately asked, "How long?" James answered, "Indefinitely, unless your father decides otherwise." Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Dad, I know I cannot undo what I did, but please do not take everything away from me." I told him I was not interested in revenge. But before I could say anything else, Emily suddenly stood up. She looked at Daniel and said, "You did not tell me you tried to take Dad's money." Daniel became defensive, and within seconds the two of them began arguing. I sat quietly and realized something painful. Even after discovering the truth about my fortune, they were still fighting over money. Then James interrupted them. "There is something neither of you knows." He opened a final folder and placed it on the table. "Your father has already decided what will happen to the entire $3 billion fortune." Both of my children turned toward me, waiting for the answer. I looked at them and finally said, "You are both going to be very surprised." I watched Daniel and Emily staring at me, waiting to hear what I planned to do with the $3 billion fortune. I opened the final folder and placed the documents on the table. "Neither of you is receiving control of my company," I said. Daniel looked disappointed, while Emily seemed confused. I explained that I had created a new foundation years earlier, designed to help elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. A large portion of my fortune would now go toward that foundation. "You are giving away billions?" Daniel asked in disbelief. I nodded. Money should help people, not turn families against each other. But I also told them that I was not cutting them out completely. Each of them would receive a modest inheritance, enough to live comfortably, but neither would ever have control over the company. Their inheritance would also remain, protected by conditions, requiring them to use the money responsibly and never attempt to manipulate another family member for financial gain. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "So after everything I did, you are still leaving something for me?" I smiled sadly. "I am leaving you a chance, not a reward." Emily began crying and apologized for judging me, by the way. I dressed and lived. She admitted that she had also believed I was nearly broke. I told them both that being poor and being humble were not the same thing. Then James interrupted us with another surprising update. The board had discovered that Daniel's false estate claim had been influenced by someone outside the family. Someone had been encouraging him to believe that I was hiding money and that he could legally take control of it. I asked who it was. James looked at me and said, "Your son's financial advisor." I immediately remembered meeting that man several times. He had always been unusually interested in my retirement and personal finances. Now I understood why. He had not simply advised Daniel. He had been trying to position himself between my son and my fortune. I looked at James and asked him why the advisor had been so interested in my finances. He opened a report showing several messages between the advisor and Daniel. The advisor had convinced my son that I was hiding billions from the family, and that retirement had made me too weak to protect the money. Daniel had believed every word. I felt disappointed, but I also realized that my son had made his own choices. Then James showed me something that changed the situation again. The advisor had secretly arranged meetings with people who wanted to buy shares in my company. He had been planning to convince Daniel to take control of my fortune and then sell parts of the company. I asked James what would happen next. He said the board had enough evidence to remove the advisor and report his actions. Daniel sat quietly after hearing this. Then he looked at me and said he finally understood why I had kept my wealth private. He said he had judged me because of my clothes and my simple life. I told him that money had never been the real test. His choices were the test. Emily then asked me what I wanted from them. I looked at both of my children and said I wanted only one thing. I wanted them to become people who could stand on their own without waiting for my money. Daniel started crying and apologized to me for the first time without asking for anything. I accepted his apology, but told him trust would take time to rebuild. Then James placed one final document in front of me. It showed that my company had grown even more than we expected. My fortune was now worth more than $3.4 billion. I looked at the number for a moment and closed the folder. That number does not impress me anymore. I had finally learned that the real value of my life was not sitting inside a bank account. The next morning I returned to the company for the final board meeting. Daniel came with me because he wanted to accept responsibility for what he had done. The board removed his financial advisor and officially closed every account connected to the false estate claim. Daniel then stood in front of everyone and admitted that he had judged his father by his appearance. He said he believed I was a poor retired man who had nothing left. I looked at him and told him that his mistake was not thinking I was poor. His mistake was believing that my money gave him a right to control my life. After the meeting, James handed me the final trust papers. My decision was now official. The company would remain under my control while most of my fortune would go toward the foundation for elderly people. Daniel and Emily would receive their inheritance later in life under strict conditions. Neither of them would ever control my company. Daniel looked at me and asked if I still wanted him in my life. I told him that I never wanted to lose my son. I only wanted him to understand why I had hidden my wealth. That evening we returned to my apartment. Emily looked around and said she finally understood why I liked living there. It was quiet and peaceful and nobody cared about how much money I had. Daniel sat beside me and said he wanted to start again. I told him that rebuilding trust would take time, but I was willing to give him that chance. Then my phone rang. It was James with one final update about my fortune. The number was much higher than anyone expected, and this time, I did not feel proud of the money. I simply smiled because I finally knew that my family had learned the lesson. I wanted them to learn. The next morning, I sat alone in my apartment and looked at the old jacket my family had laughed at. For years I had worn it, because I wanted a quiet life and because I never wanted my children to measure my worth by my bank account. Daniel and Emily eventually came to see me without asking about money. Daniel sat beside me and said he finally understood why I had hidden my fortune. He said he had treated me like a helpless old man because he believed I had nothing left. I told him that I had not needed him to know about my billions. I had only needed him to respect me as his father. He promised that he would never make the same mistake again. I forgave him, but I also told him that trust would have to be rebuilt through actions. Emily agreed and said she wanted to help with the foundation I had created for elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. Months passed, and I watched both of my children change. They stopped asking about my fortune and started asking how they could help other people. That was the moment I knew my decision had been right. My $3 billion fortune had given me comfort, but it had also shown me something money could never buy. It showed me who my children really were, and it gave them a chance to become better people. I never stopped wearing my old jacket either. One afternoon, Daniel saw me wearing it and smiled. "Dad, you still look like that retired beggar everyone thought you were." I laughed and told him, "Maybe that is the best thing that ever happened to me." He hugged me, and for the first time I felt that my family had finally understood the lesson. I was never valuable because I owned billions. I was valuable because I was their father. And that was the one fortune I never wanted to hide.